Hello everyone, welcome back to Z Academy. I'm ZJ, your host for today. In today's video, I'll be showing you step by step on how to build a to-do application. This is an imperfect video, and by that, I mean that you'll be able to see all the errors that I encountered throughout this whole process. Hopefully, you'll be able to learn how to debug some of these errors yourself. I would also expect you to have some basic knowledge of React, Bootstrap, and JavaScript. However, if you're not familiar with this, fear not. Go ahead and check out some of these videos instead. Now, let's get started. Before we get started, I drew up a short sketch of what this to-do application would look like. There will be a field for us to add items or tasks, and there will be a nav bar with 3 tabs, all active and completed. For the active, there will be fields that describes what the task is, and a checkbox for us to mark it as completed. And for the completed, this checkbox would be checked and the description would be striked out. And for the all tab, the active task will be shown first, followed by the completed task. Here is also the initial data structure that I'll be using to build out this application, which would kind of change over time as we start integrating more stuff to it. Now, let's jump right in. Let's get started by creating a React application. We can do this by typing npx create React app to do app. To do app would be the name of the folder or the application. I forgot the E over here. And now let's wait for it to create. Now let's open this up in VS Code by typing code to do app. Let's first remove the default code that is in app.js. Let's do npm start. So for this to-do application, we will need 3 main components. The first would be a field to add the task. The second would be the navbar, which will comprise of all active and completed. The last component would be a list of tasks. Now let's create a folder called components and create a file for each of these components. Let's create an add item bar, which is for adding tasks. Have another component called nav bar, and one more component called task list. Now let's import each of these components in. I'll be using a CSS framework called Bootstrap. So let's go ahead and install that. npm install React Bootstrap. What this does is that it basically installs the Bootstrap CSS framework. For the add item bar, I'll be looking for a field that looks like this. So let's go ahead and add that from Bootstrap. Let's add a floating label and a form control. Let's give this a label of an task and a placeholder of that task. So right now you're not seeing anything here because we have not imported Bootstrap in yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Now let's go ahead and add the navbar as well. For the navbar, I'll be going for a look on something like this. So let's go ahead and add that. Let's add a nav. And in each of these nav, let's have a component called navbar item. Let's create this component. This navbar item, let's have a nav item. Open nav. Let's import nav and navbar item. We are going to have 3 of these. And let's give each of these a prop called text. And each of these tags would have 1, 2, and 3. And here, let's pass in the props and reconstruct text from props. Let's go to the console. And we can see that props has a property called text with a value of completed. This is what we are destructuring here. Let's use the text value, and there we go. Let's also give this a variant of text so that there's this style over here. Next, let's add our task list. So we are going to go for the style something like this. So let's go ahead and add a list group from Bootstrap. And in each of this, we are going to have a component called task. Let's create that component. Each of this component, we're going to have the list group item. And in this list group item, there is some description of the task. Again, let's import task. There we go. We also want a checkbox in here as well. So we can do fun check, which is the type of checkbox. And we want this to be on the same line. We can do this through the inline property. There we go. Let's create a model of this task. And this is what the basic application kind of look like. Now that we have the basic skeleton of the application, we can start connecting them together. And in order to do that, we need to have some form of data. So let's copy this over. Let's add a little more data to it. Now, we will need to pass this content variable into the task list props so that it would be able to access the data. Again, let's destructure it from props. Now, let's simply just iterate over this content prop by using the map function. we can return a task. And this is saying that content.map is not a function. That is because our data structure is as such. Only active is an array and content is not an array. So we can do take.map. Next, we will need to change the description as well. So let's have the props as well. But before that, let's take a look at what content is. This is what we are iterating over. So there's an ID and a description. So we can pass in the description into class as well. Let's give this a refresh. And notice that React is complaining about every child in the list needs to have a unique key prop. This simply means that we need to give it a key property, and that is what the task ID is for. And there, that error is now gone. Now let's destructure the description from the prompts. And there we go. Now we will need the task here to reflect which tab we have clicked on. So to do that, we can use the useState hook from React. Let's call it current and give it a default value of all. Again, let's import useState. And in order to do that, we will have an onClick function in navbar item that would track the changes to the tabs. Let's call this handle click. So let's create this function. And in this function, we would need the set current function. So let's pass this in. So we can do this by setting this to text. And let's destructure it from props as well. Let's console log current and see it change as we click on the text. Active and completed. So do you notice the difference in capitalization? Let's normalize that throughout by setting this to a lowercase. Also, do you notice that there has been a lot of repetition here? We can create an object called navigation and look through this object. ID and a title on all. So let's look through navigation to create the nav bars. Then let's give this a unique key prop. So notice that all this ID is always unique, because if it is not unique, there would be issues. So now that we are able to keep track of which tab we have clicked on through the cur variable, we would need to access this variable in task list as well. However, notice that navbar and task list is on the same component level. So we will need to bring this up a comp level to add instead. And again, let's pass set current in to navbar. Let's destructure set current in props. Now, notice that we are not using set current in here at all. So what we can do is to actually pass all the props in like this. So there would be no need to restructure. So notice this error here. We forgot to import useState again. Let's give this a refresh. Now, we will need to pass current in as prop so that task list would be able to access the value of it. Let's destructure it again here. Now, we will need a way to get the correct array from content. So let's create a new variable called list, and if current is all, then we would need both the active and combined with the completed task. Before that, let's deconstruct active and completed from the content object. Then we can do active dot concat with completed else and content earn. So what it is doing here is that it checks if current is all, which means whether or not we click on the tab all. And if we click on all, it would join the active and completed array and give that as a value. Else, it would give either active or completed. So let's check by logging it to the console. So notice that there is active and completed because by default we are on the all tab. So let's change this to list instead. And now if we click on active, only the active task is shown. Completed, only the completed task is shown, and all is both active and completed. Now let's work on adding tasks to content. In order to do that, we would need to set the content in add item bar. We can do that with useState as well. So we will set the default value to what we had before. Now let's pass in the set content function. Again, let's destructure it from props. Now we can make use of this event called onKeyDown. Let's have a handle key press function. Handle key press. Now, for each of these events, we would be able to use a parameter called event. Let's just check what this provides us with. So when we type something here, this is happening because we have set content here and it is set to nothing. So let's first comment this out. If we type anything here, there will be this whole list of events for each key press that we do. If we press enter, it would have a key code of 13, which is what we would want to check for. So if event.keycode is 13, then we would set the content. So we can make use of the previous content. So when we add a task here, we want to add this to the active array. So what we can do is destructure the active array from the previous content. Then we can push the new item in. So let's give this a random value of n and a description of something. So again, let's look at the event here to find out what the description should be. So if you look at event target, and the value would be what we typed in. So this would be event.target.value. And now we can pass in the previous content, which everything is the same, and replace the active. Now, if we enter again, this will be added here to the active task. And now, we are basically done with adding the functionalities for the to-do application. Now, let's add some styles to this to-do application. Let's add a container to this application so that it does not extend to the width of this browser. Let's also give this container a little background color, light, so that it is grayish. And let's give this a little shadow as well. And also some padding. Now, let's head over to the nav bar. I want to give this nav bar item background, a dark background color, and also rounded corners. Now, I don't really like this blue font color, so let's change that as well. Now, let's add some logic so that this navbar item only has dark background when it is clicked on. To do that, we can pass in the current variable. Since we are passing all the props in, we do not need to do anything for the navbar.js file. We can simply deconstruct it here. Now, let's add some logic to it. So let's check if current is x dot lowercase. This kind of checks whether or not the navbar is being clicked on. And so if it is clicked on, I'll give it this styles. So if this is true, the nav item would have these two classes. And if it is not true, they would not have these two classes. Now, notice that because we have a light font color, the active and completed tab is not viewable. So let's add some logic. So let's check if the tab is being clicked on. So if it is clicked on, then it should have a light font color, else they would have a dark font color, which is black. And there we go. Now let's go to the add item bar and add some spacing between the add item bar and the nav bar. Let's add a class of margin bottom 3. So in Bootstrap, margin and paddings have a range of 1 to 5, and the higher it is, the more gap there would be. So if you choose 5, this would have a larger gap. Now, I want the navbar and the list group to kind of be viewed as connected. To do that, let's add a background color to the task. Give this a background color of dark. Now, I wouldn't want these lines in between. So let's remove the border. Now, we couldn't view the text. So let's give this a font color of white. Now, notice that there is still border for the nav bar. So let's remove that as well. Now, because we have rounded corners, let's move this down a little as well. Let's remove this gap by navigating to the index.css file. We can check which element we need to add this style to by going to Inspect, clicking this icon here, and pressing on the element that we want. We can see that this has a class of nav. So what we can do is div.nav. So what this does is basically it looks for any div that has a class of nav. Then we can add a margin to the bottom by doing margin bottom mag is 7 pixels. This would move this nav class down. And there we go. It now looks connected. We would want different styles if the task is completed. Let's add some styles to the completed task. So we would need a way to check for whether or not this task is completed. To do that, we can add another property to the object. So let's add a property of completed and give it a value of false for active task and a value of true for completed task. Now let's go back to the task.js and we would need to pass in the task in here. So we would have changed the prop that we pass in. So let's change this to task instead of description. Now let's destructure task and also destructure description and completed from task. Then let's enclose the description in a span tag. Then let's give this span a class that checks for whether or not it is completed. So if it is completed, then this should have text, decoration, line, rule. We would also want to disable this checkbox. So we can do the disable property and set it to completed. We would also want a tick on the checkbox as well. So we can do checked would be completed as well. Now, if we click on active, so this is happening because we have not added the functionality to do that. So let's do that right now. To do that, we would need the set content function so that we would be able to update the function. So let's destructure it from props and pass that in to task list. Next, let's go to task list and destructure set content here as well. Then let's pass this into task. Now let's go back to task and provide that with a onChange event handler. Let's call this handle onChange and let's create this function. So in this function, we will need to set the task completed property to true. Next, we will need to update the content as well. So let's do set content and do the previous content and add the task to the completed array. Now, we will also need to remove this task from the active array as well. We can do this by filtering for the task. So what this is doing is that it is checking whether or not it is the current task. And if it is not, then this would be in the new active array. Now let's return the new content. And now if we click on active, now there's an error here because push is the object itself, not an array. We need to get the completed array. Now if we click on active, this would now be changed to the completed task. And that is it. Let's start integrating Firebase into our application. For this project, we will be using Firebase hosting for putting our application out onto the web and also Firebase real-time database for storing our data. Now, let's head over to the Firebase console. The link for this is down in the description below. Also, you can log into this with your Gmail account. Let's hit Add Project and give this a name of To-Do App. Hit Continue, Continue, and select a default account. Let's create a project and wait for it to finish. Hit Continue. Let's click on this icon here for web and give this a nickname of To-Do App. Let's also select this option for setting up Firebase hosting. We would always be given a default URL for the site, but we could also create a new site. So let's do zcademy/To-Do App. Let's register this app. Then let's follow the instructions here. Let's install Firebase into our project. Then let's create a folder under source called Firebase. In this Firebase folder, let's create a file called .credentials.js. Let's copy this Firebase config and put it in this .credentials file. Let's also export it so that we can import it again later. Let's create another file called Firebase init. In this file, let's copy over the import statements and the initialization steps. For this Firebase config, we would import the one we have in .credentials. Next, let's install Firebase tools. Next, now let's log into Firebase. So it says here that I am already logged in, but in other cases, it would redirect you to the web browser and you have to log in from there. Let's do Firebase init. Let's enlarge the screen and hit yes for proceed. Then let's select real-time database by pressing space and also hosting by pressing space. Next, hit enter to proceed. Then let's hit enter to select the option to use an existing project. We would select the To-Do app that we created earlier. Hit yes to set up real-time database. You can choose whichever location you want, but for the purpose of this project, I'll be selecting US Central 1. This would be creating the rules for the database. And we would want to use the build folder as the public directory. We would choose yes for this option and no for the GitHub deploy. It is important to note here that we do not want to override it. So let's hit no here. Now we are ready to deploy it to the web. But before that, let's add this to the firebase.json file. Now let us build the project. npm run build. This would create a folder called build. Now we are ready to deploy this out onto the web. We can head over by going to this URL. There, our application is now out on the web. Now let's hit continue to console and go to the real-time database. Now let us start integrating the database into our application. Let's start off by creating a folder here called Firebase Database. Let's head over to Firebase init and create a variable called database and init the database. Let's also export this so that we can use it. Now let's head over to Firebase database and we will start by adding tasks to the database. To do that, let's create a function called add task. First, let's create a reference to the database. This basically creates a link to the active URL where we would be able to create tasks under this active key. Now, let us create a new task by pushing to the database. Now, let's import ref from Firebase. And import push as well. Now, let's use this set function from Firebase to set this new task to the following value. It should have the description and the completed value. Now, let's head over to add item bar. We would have to call this add task function here, but before that, let's export this function. Then let's call add task here, and we should be passing in the description. Let's create a variable called task here and give this a description and the completed property of false. Then we can pass this task in as a parameter. Let's go back to Firebase database and we can put task here. Then let's get the task description and we pass completed. Now let's save the changes in add item bar and we can test it out. Let's import database from Firebase init. So there's a typo here, so let's change that as well. And we would need to import get database from Firebase. Now, let's console log new task and see what it returns. Let's add a task here and go to the console. Let's select this and we can see that it has a property of key, which we would want to return. So let's return new task.key and in add item bar, let's set the return value to key ID. Now, we can change this to be using task and the key ID. Let's add another task called active task 2. Let's check our content and ensure that everything's right. Now, let's head over to Firebase database and refresh the page. Now we can see that there's no data here, as we have been denied of the permission. So let's head over to the database.rules and change this to true. Let's head over to the rules here and change it to true as well. Now let's head back and add a task of active task 3. Now let's head over to the Firebase console and check our data. It has now been successfully added in. There are various ways that you can read from the database. Let's look at the documentation. We would want to use this get function here. Let's copy this and head over to app.js. Let's minimize this and paste the code here. Let's change this to database ref and call the ref function. This basically gets the path to the active task. Let's change this to database ref and save. Let's import get. Let's refresh this page. Here we can see that this is being retrieved from the database. This is what snapshot.file is. Let's try adding more tasks to the database and see how it changes. Notice that this is not an array. So let's iterate through this with the key. This ID would basically be this. Then let's create a variable called task and have the ID be ID. The description would be task ID, and completed would be true since this is the active path. Let's log this task. Now notice that this is not the structure that we wanted, so we should further access the property of description here, and also the value of completed. This structure is now correct and the same as what we have here. Let's remove the original data. Then let's create an active array here. And set the content to what we have from the database. Again, we can use the previous content and return previous content with the active array replaced. Now, notice that this is being called incrementally. We can get around this by using the use effect hook. Let's put this so-called login. Now, what this basically does is that it is only called once. Because the dependency array is blank, it would only be called once. So this is currently blank as we have not added the task to active array. So let's add it in. Now, this is basically the easiest way to read from the database. However, I personally think that this is not the preferred way as it does not promote code reusability. So let's move this whole code block into the Firebase database file. Let's create a function called get active tasks and paste it in. Let's remove the use effect hook and import get. Let's also remove set content. Now let's enclose this in a try-catch block instead. Let's set the value of snapshot to be this. Now we'll be utilizing a wait to wait for the promise. Then let's move this code block in as well. Let's move the active variable out of the if block and return it here. Then let's head over to add.js and set the content here. Let's call the getActiveTask function to return the task that we got from the database and update the content. Again, there's too many renders because it kept calling this function over and over again. We can get past this by using the use effect hook again. Now it is saying that active.concat is not a function. Let's check if content is still in the structure that we wanted. You'll notice that active is now a promise instead of an array. So we will call this function and get the promise. We will call this active and set the content within the result of the promise. And there we go. Remember what I've mentioned about code reusability earlier? We can be using this same function to be getting the completed task as well. So let's change this function to accommodate that. Let's pass in variable called status, which would either be active or completed. And we can change this path to that status. Then let's head over to add.js and pass in the parameter of active. We can copy this whole code and change it to complete. Let's also change the name to completed as well. Now let's refresh the page. Now let's head over to Firebase database file and add a function to complete the task. Let's call this complete task. Before that, let's change the name of the function as well. Let's change it to get task. Let's open the task.js file and look at this handle on change function. Notice here that we are adding it to the completed array and removing it from active. So we can use the same logic in complete tasks as well. Let's get a reference to the database. And pass the task in as a parameter. Let's call this function here and pass task in. Let's head over to Firebase console and click on this task. Notice that the path here includes the task ID. So we will have changed this path to include that as well. Then we can use the remove function to remove this task from the database. Then we can use the add task function here as well to add the task to completed. We will have to make minor tweaks to this function as well. Let's give this a status as well and replace it with status. Do not forget to change the functions to pass in the status as well. One of it is in the add item bar, and we will be adding active here. Now we have completed everything, and let's test it out. Let's add another class here called active task 5. Let's complete this task. Now, notice that this is getting duplicated. One likely reason is that this component is not pure because we might be mutating the state somewhere in our code. Let's take a look at tasks where this onChange function is getting implemented. We can see that we are mutating the completed array here. So what we can do instead is to create a new array called completed and use the current completed array with the new task. Then replace this with completed. So what this does is that it creates a new array with the previous values and add in the new task. Now let's refresh this page and we can check this again. Notice that there's no longer any duplication. Next, let's add a few more items here. So the same issue is happening with adding tasks as well. Let's head over to add item bar. We can see that we are mutating the active array as well. So we can do the same thing here by creating an active array with the current active array and adding in the new task. Now let's add another task here. We can see that this solves the issue. Right now, the previous value is getting deleted off because we are missing the spread operator here. Let's add that in and refresh. Let's add a few more tasks. And now it all works without any duplication. Something that I want to do here is to also clear off this value after entering enter. What we can do is to set the event.target.value to be an empty string. Let's add another task and there we go. Let's refresh the page again. Now React is also throwing a warning here saying that it is receiving false for the class name. So let's head over to task. What we can do is to change this to a conditional statement instead. Let's refresh. Also, notice this warning here. We should be using the strict comparison. Let's save the changes. And this is all that there is to this to-do application. Thank you for your time watching this video. I hope that this video helps in your learning process. If you find this video helpful, please like, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you have any ideas on future content that you're interested in learning, or suggestions on how I can improve to help you learn better, feel free to leave a comment down below. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.